So, Rachel, what is your profession and how did you get into it?
So I'm a solicitor. I specialise in family law, and in particular, within family law, I specialise in domestic abuse and stalking cases. So the vast majority of my cases will have coercive control or domestic abuse or stalking as some kind of element to it, often in relation to disputes between parents about the children, sometimes about protective orders, etc. How did I get into it? I suppose in a way I fell into it really. I'd always been interested in feminism and domestic abuse. When I was at university, I did my dissertation about how the law was failing victims of domestic abuse. I never really thought that I would be able to specialise in that as a career, though. And then when I joined the firm that I'm now a director at, I just started to obviously find victims coming to see me as clients, and really, I suppose, realised that they were being failed still by the system, that solicitors didn't seem to understand how dangerous domestic abuse was, particularly if it was non-physical domestic abuse. I think there's still a lack of understanding around that. And I suppose that through my interest in that area, and I wanted to do more for victims and fight their corner, I was suddenly bombarded with a lot of work, and I ended up setting up a whole department to deal with that. There's now about 30 of us that just deal in these kind of cases, but it literally started from nothing.
Mm-hmm. And it's, as much as it is impressive that you started this whole department, it's almost quite depressing that there needs to be a department specialising in that. It shows how big the problem is.
Absolutely. I always say that really victims shouldn't need to come and see me or my team. That the police should be doing more so that victims don't have to come and get protective orders. And victims shouldn't have to spend years fighting, perpetrators of domestic abuse through the family courts. They're still being attacked, really, and perpetrators will use the family court system to continue that abuse after separation, unfortunately. So it would be ideal if our department wasn't needed.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you had an interest in feminism. How do you view feminism? Because there's a lot of dispute around that.
I think feminism obviously is putting women first, and acknowledging that women, we're still not equal. We're a long way from that. And I think, just because we have, perhaps the Equal Pay Act, etc., people tend to think that the struggle is over, but I really don't see that in terms of my work. Even I see it on a daily basis that women are often coming off second on a regular basis. If you look at, divorces, etc., so often women will walk away without making a financial claim against their husband out of fear, basically. They just will say, I'm glad to get out with my life. I'm glad to get out with the children. There's no way I want to risk stirring that up and provoking my husband into coming for me. So they will walk away, from thousands and thousands of pounds on a regular basis. And whilst I do have male victims as clients as well, I don't see the same fear. I think it's a very different scenario for men. I'm not saying that they're never victims, but I don't think that they actually fear for their lives. I've never met a male client that has felt like that.
Why do you think that this is considerably a male problem? Do you think it's just that men generally will resort to violence more than women?
I think, this is a problem that's been around for thousands and thousands of years, isn't it? It's not something that's recent. I do think that men tend to be more aggressive than women. Certainly they are physically stronger than women, so they're able to exert, brute force onto a woman. And we live in a misogynistic society. There's no two ways about that, in my view. And I think even women fall foul of that. And, I talk about quite often the problem with the police and what, how misogynistic the police force is as a culture. I'm not the only person to say that, obviously, but I find that even the female police officers will end up getting involved in that, because it's almost as though that's the only way to survive within that organisation is to copy the culture and to follow suit. And if you don't, then you're never going to get on very well within that. And I remember myself as a trainee solicitor when I started at the company that, like I say, I'm still with. I started as a trainee. I'm now a director. But when I first started there, there weren't really many women in management positions within the organisation. And I remember thinking, well, if I want to get on in this organisation, I'm going to have to kind of act like one of the blokes to some extent. And I remember starting to take golf lessons, etc., so that I would be able to go on the golf course with the male partners. And I honestly felt that was the only way that I would be able to get on. And I remember myself at some points almost, not acting like a man, that would be taking it too far, but I suppose mimicking the type of culture and way of working that the male solicitors did. And it was only, a while after that, I realised what was happening. And I just thought, actually, you don't need to do it like that. You can do it as a woman and still be like a woman and still be successful. Unfortunately, it worked out okay for me, but, it did affect me. And I know that it affects lots and lots of other women in different professions.
And I just want to play devil's advocate a bit, and just maybe if a male was to maybe respond to what you're saying and maybe say that feminism maybe should be about equality and everyone should be treated equal, and it shouldn't be women first, it should be everyone first. So it's like the same sort of argument that came up with the Black Lives Matter protests, where people would say all lives matter. What would you say to that as a response?
Well, I think that, you fight your fight and let the feminists fight their fight. It's like saying, well, you shouldn't do that sponsored run for breast cancer, because what about all the other cancers? And there is a real problem with how women are treated in society. That's not to say that men don't have any issues which affect them. Of course they do. And there's nothing to stop men setting up their own battles in respect of that. And I actually think that, the whole thing of the patriarchy and a misogynistic society actually damages men as well. So I do think that men would be better off if that wasn't happening. And, it doesn't make an ideal scenario for men to live within that. But I don't think you can criticise somebody for seeing a massive inequality that affects 50% of the population and then complain that they're not including men, because I think men start from a much more powerful position. But like I say, that's not to say that they don't have things that they face that need to improve as well.
I think some good examples to me of male feminists. I'm going to be doing a second part to this episode, this sort of subject. And I don't know if you've heard of Positive News. They're a magazine they send out quarterly. It's just uplifting stories, basically, challenges the main narrative. And the cover story of the last one was men standing up against domestic violence against women. And it was just 4 profiles of different men. And one of them, he runs an organization called Beyond Equality, and they go to schools and to speak with groups of boys and kind of parse out their perceptions about gender and challenge them a bit, and just make sure, try to ensure that these boys aren't going to grow up to have these horrible misconceptions. So I think that's a great example of men doing what they can to push the feminism movement forward.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think that's really important. And that's, you know, important that men do that. And you know, sometimes I think, well, domestic abuse in a way isn't a women's problem, it's a men's problem more than a women's problem, because, you know, it's men that need to change. And again, I do realise that, you know, it's not necessarily as easy as people think, that we are brought up in a society, and even if you try your best not to be a certain way or to try and view everybody equally, we're still tainted with the culture that we're brought up in. So it isn't easy, and there's, you know, lots and lots of areas in which that can change. But I do think that men certainly need to do that, and, you know, young boys need to see positive male role models and realise that there is another way.
You've spoken before about the fact that less than 1% of rape cases, is it go to trial or get prosecuted?
Less than 1% go to trial.
Right. And why is that? What's so broken in the system?
Gosh, all of it, really.
Right.
You know, and again, it does go quite deep, I think. There are problems with how the police respond to it. There are problems with how the CPS then deal with that. And it's been looked at previously that the CPS had an artificially high bar in respect of bringing charges forward. You know, there are problems in the whole system in terms of the ordeal that a woman gets put through in terms of the trial itself. And I think that, you know, also problems in society in the way we see it. And I think all of that means that lots of women probably don't even report it in the first place. I know lots of women that work within the criminal justice system who will say, I wouldn't report a rape if that happened to me, because I wouldn't want to go through what I see happening on a daily basis. It's, you know, it's re-victimizing. It's traumatic in itself. And, you know, at the moment, you could be waiting for 2 years or more for that process to be finished. So I think, you know, all of that means that it's a surprise that anybody even reports it, really. But there are lots of myths, again, within our own culture about what a real rape victim should look like and how they should act, etc. You know, you can't be drunk, you can't be wearing something that is seen as provocative, etc. And I think, you know, there's still too much focus on the victim and what they did, what they said, how they acted. And I think that's really unfair. The focus should just be on the rapist. You know, there's only one thing that causes rape, and that's the rapist. But I think within society, people still focus on the victim, to the point where often victims themselves don't realise they are victims, because they will say, well, yeah, but I went out, I was drunk, it's my fault. And I hear that from clients that will talk about what's happened to them, or clients will say, if I ask them, you know, has your husband ever raped you? They'll say no. If you then say, well, has he ever forced himself on you or made you do anything that sexually that you didn't want to do, then often they'll say yes. And really, there's no distinction between those two things, but they believe that often that you can't be raped by your husband. Obviously, that situation changed in the mid-90s. But, you know, still, I think predominantly a lot of women still think that really you can't be raped by your husband. And yes, you might not want to have sex, but you kind of have to, and that's just how it is. So I think all of these things really make it very difficult for women to come forward. And, you know, I'm quite sure that all of these kind of stereotypes and myths play into, you know, all the decisions that are made by everyone within that criminal justice system, be it the police, the CPS, juries. You know, I'm quite sure that you know, all of this impacts on the minds of juries, and whether or not they think the victim has acted like a real victim should, etc. So yeah, all of that. And like I say, I'm not sure I would report a rape either, to be honest. I just think the system is quite barbaric.
Have you found any common themes in the domestic violence cases that you work on? Is there any reasons for domestic violence that crop up more often than others?
I think it's very difficult. Like I say, I think there are lots and lots of reasons. The biggest factor, obviously, is that predominantly this is an issue of male violence against women. Like I say, that's not to say it never happens the other way, but the vast majority of the significant cases, I would say, that I've come across in my career have been male violence against women. I think that the thing that I see most commonly, and almost the essence of what domestic abuse is coercive control. And I think that this is something that is fairly new in terms of how people talk about domestic abuse. A few years ago, it didn't really exist. It wasn't a criminal offence like it is now. And I think that, this is what underlies all of the situations of domestic abuse, particularly that I've come across in my career. I would say it's what makes women unable to leave. Sometimes it explains the fear, and why they don't leave, why they do what they're basically being told to do, even without physical violence. It doesn't need to get physical. And it's kind of the micromanagement of every aspect of a woman's life. And the perpetrator will set out to psychologically terrorise the victim. And they can do that in ways that individually might seem insignificant. But when you put them all together and you imagine living that every day, day in, day out, then you just only then can you understand how that would psychologically wear you down and break you.
Going back to what you were saying before about putting the blame on the victim, I think that made me think of the Sarah Everard case, in which I saw a lot of the narrative, and some of it coming from the police, was telling women not to walk home on their own, or walking home in the dark, or not wear a short skirt, or ask a police officer for his badge. And that just seems to be exactly what it is. It's like there wasn't anything wrong with what happened with whoever done what they did to Sarah Everard with that man. It was on her. That was what they were intentionally saying. It was horrible.
Yeah, and I think that is very, very common. We do as a society blame women for things that happen to them, and until we change that focus and focus on the perpetrator, it almost lets the perpetrator off with, well, they can't help themselves. That's just what it's almost like saying that's what men do. And I think that's unfair to men as well, to say that men can't help themselves in these situations. So if you get drunk and wear a short skirt, you're going to get raped, and actually you might get murdered as well. I'm quite sure most men are not like that. So like I say, I think by changing this narrative, it would benefit men as well as women. But this still happens every day. I speak to clients that will say, well, I've been told that I'm being stalked, so I've been told that I need to change the way I go to work. I need to perhaps think about moving house. I need to think about changing my name. I've been told that because I'm being stalked on Twitter, I've got to come off Twitter. I've got to close my Instagram account, etc. Well, why should you have to do that as a victim? All that does is close down your life and restrict your freedoms, when really what we should be doing is again focusing on the perpetrator. And it just seems that this is what the police will tell victims, it's almost like an excuse not to intervene, not to take a statement, not to bring charges. The victim has just got to ensure that it doesn't happen again by changing her behaviour, and that's wrong, and it leaves that perpetrator out there, possibly to move on to another victim, or actually to increase their behaviour towards the victim, because often, you know, I'm also the chair of Paladin, which is the National Stalking Advocacy Service. And, you know, we've been saying for years that this is really dangerous advice that the police give about this. And if you tell a victim, well, just change your telephone number, then that often actually escalates the behaviour of the perpetrator and puts the victim at more risk, because when we look at stalking, we're looking at somebody who is obsessed and fixated on the victim. So do you really think that by changing your mobile telephone number, the perpetrator is going to say, okay, well, that's it, that's the end of the line, isn't it? All they're going to do is change their behaviour, and perhaps they're going to have to start doing things more directly. So maybe they're going to have to start turning up at your place of work for you to notice them, because they can't leave that message on your answer phone, or they can't send that text message to you. So actually that advice is potentially putting women at more risk. So again, you know, what the police need to do is stop all that focus on what has the victim done before, what can the victim do going forward, and just deal with the behaviour and bring charges. We don't see this in other crimes like burglary, etc. You know, and it just seems to be crimes that disproportionately affect women that are treated in this way. Domestic abuse, stalking, sexual offences, rape, coercive control, all of those offences are ones that predominantly affect women, and we seem to treat them very, very differently to any other crime.
I mean, it's like those cases like predominantly affect women as the victims, but they also, like the majority of those cases, the perpetrators are men. So it's like it's two different things there. It's maybe the reason that they're not tried is because it's men that are being tried, and it's women who are victims.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I always talk about, again, this has all come from what victims tell me, but in far too many cases, I won't say every case I deal with, but the majority of cases, when victims do report these crimes to the police, very often they're met with an attitude of disbelief. So the clients will come to me as a solicitor and then pay me thousands of pounds that they should never have to pay for me to help them put together evidence to go back to the police with to prove what's happening to them. Well, that's the job of the police, to investigate crimes. It's what they do. You know, if you report a burglary, you'll have the scenes of crimes van come round. They'll be taking fingerprints, etc. You know, where possible, but they don't do that in cases of stalking and domestic abuse. In too many cases, it's like I say, you have to almost convince the police that you're not lying before they'll even take a statement, and that's just wrong.
What impact did the pandemic have on domestic violence cases? I know stalking, domestic violence, the cases went up massively, which like a lot of people were surprised about, but when you actually think about it, it was a lockdown. People were literally trapped in houses with the perpetrator. Yeah,
and even where they'd separated, victims couldn't go to work, they couldn't access help, so they felt, you know, they were particularly vulnerable, and perpetrators knew that. They knew where the victim was going to be, you know, for the vast majority of the time. Also, perhaps the perpetrator maybe wasn't working, maybe been furloughed and suddenly had all this time on his hands. And again, if you're dealing with somebody who's obsessed and fixated, if you suddenly give that person another 6 hours to their day, well, obviously they're going to use those 6 hours to obsess about the victim. So I think all of those things combined. And I know a lot of women felt as though they couldn't even report it to the police at that time. A lot of them would say, well, I didn't want to waste the time, because that's how they feel when they report. But particularly when the pandemic started, I think that they felt that what was happening to them wasn't important enough. you know, and that the police had all of these other things to do, when the reality wasn't actually like that. I mean, I've spoken to police officers that said when the pandemic struck, really, we didn't have that much to do, you know, in terms of how they would normally be being contacted by the public. But certainly the number of incidents just went through the roof. And to be honest, it's not really gone down a great deal in my experience, in terms of the number of calls that we're getting. And, you know, all of this is made worse by the waiting, you know, of the court system, etc., not just the criminal court system, but the family court system as well. There's a huge backlog in terms of cases, which has meant that, you know, that they're taking much longer to resolve, which again is much more stressful for victims.
I think a conversation I kept on seeing in the narrative following the Me Too movement was men saying, this means that we can't flirt with women, we can't ask to buy a woman a drink. And well, for me, I think one of the questions a lot of people were asking was, where's the line? Where can we draw the line to where women feel safe and where we can still have male-female relationships? And I think a big one for me in like these situations where in bars or clubs is that if a man was to ask a woman to buy her a drink and she was to say no, that's the end of the conversation. Yeah. I think a lot of these things that men's egos can be so fragile and small is that they can't take that action. Yeah. And so they keep pushing it. And I think a lot of these cases that you're speaking about, what we're dealing with is unhealthy and weak, fragile men. I think we always speak about men being physically more powerful, but the fact that they have to resort to these sorts of horrible acts is weak-minded. So I suppose my question is, like, where do you think the line is for that sort of behaviour? Is that acceptable behaviour in bars, for example, to ask a woman to buy a drink or to try and flirt, stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, sometimes I don't even believe half of the time when I hear men say, oh, we don't know if we're allowed to do this or that. I just think, really, you know, I think most men understand the difference between flirting and, you know, offering to buy somebody a drink. They know where the line is, and where that then borders into harassment and aggression. And I've seen this many times that, you know, if you do say, no, thank you, I don't want a drink or whatever, some men become quite aggressive about that and, you know, will start to be verbally abusive to the woman, and offended by it. And I just think, well, there's absolutely no need, you know, for that to happen. And I think most men are absolutely aware of where the line is, and they choose to cross it. And by saying, you know, oh, we're not sure what we can do and what we can't do, I don't believe it. I think it's very clear. And it's about having respect for somebody, that's all. And it's about consent. And if you don't understand that, then you probably shouldn't be leaving the house.
I think it's staying on that theme. Another thing that a lot of men do is catcalling women. And I found my partner said something very interesting where if she's walking herself, she'll get catcalled a lot. Like she'll, like, quite a few times she's like came back and said, like, builder's catcalled me, and like I hate it. And then, but there's never been a time when I've been with her walking down the road and like, someone's catcalled her. And what she said about that, which I just thought was great, was that it's because they respect you enough not to do that. They don't respect me enough not to do that. And that's so like poignant to the whole situation.
Yeah, and I think it's quite a recent conversation that we've started to have about things like that. You know, people will say, well, most people will agree that domestic abuse, for example, and violence against women is wrong. But, you know, it doesn't come from nowhere. And I think that all of these smaller things like, you know, the catcalling, etc., they do have an impact on women, and not just an impact on women as in, you know, perhaps they don't feel very safe walking down the road, etc., but it also makes men feel that that's okay, and other men to think that, well, yeah, that is okay. That's how you can talk to women. You know, they aren't really our equals. They are there for our entertainment. And I think it's only very recent that we've had that conversation. And these are all the smaller things that we need to change. And actually, when you look at it as well, you know, we always talk about builders in this respect. It could be anyone, but quite often they're doing that to 13 and 14-year-old girls as well. And they think that that's okay as well. And again, it's only very recently that I think people have started to discuss it and started to accept that really it's not good enough, and we need to change these small things. But that doesn't mean that we're living in a society where you aren't allowed to think that somebody's attractive or ask them out. It's just about having respect, you know, for women. And I know a male friend of mine said it was only recently when I thought about walking home and a woman kind of walking home from the pub on her own or whatever, and being told that, you know, virtually every woman you speak to in that situation will have some kind of plan in her head. Right, if I get approached by somebody, this is what I'm going to do. It's either, you know, you've got your keys, you know, in your fist kind of thing as some ridiculous kind of weapon, or right, I've got my mobile here, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And you're constantly looking at, right, I can go there, I can do this. And men rarely think like that. I remember my male friend saying, I have never thought about anything like that about when I've been walking home from the pub. It's never crossed my mind. And I think sometimes men don't realise the impact that all of those smaller things like catcalling, etc., when all of this is happening at the same time as women opening the newspaper and it being somewhere on page 20, a tiny little piece that another woman's been murdered. You know, it doesn't even make the front pages. It's so common. All of this, I think, plays into that culture of fear. So it's about acknowledging the impact that behaviour has on women. And unless we tackle the small things, then we're never going to have a chance with the bigger ones.
Mm-hmm. Right. A few things came to my mind there when you were speaking there. For one, when say if I'm walking home in the dark or something like that, like the only time that I would feel that sort of maybe pressure or danger is if another group of males are walking towards me and it's in a dark street. But my worry is never anything to do with sexual assault, and it's never that I'm going to be murdered. It's like the worst case scenario, I'm going to get beat up, I'm going to get robbed. Another experience I've had that I think we should maybe speak about is the increase in spiking cases. Mm-hmm. When I went on my first kind of boys' holiday, and the only boys' holiday I ever went on, because I enjoyed it, but I would never do something like that again. It was just not my scene. But the first night we went out, I was spiked, and I ended up like sprawled across the street, woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning, couldn't remember anything. I was still almost hallucinating, and I managed to get back to my hotel. The worst thing that happened to me is my money was gone. And I remember thinking years later that, thank God, I'm a man. Yeah. If I was a female, that would have been 100 times worse. Yeah. And I'm going on a massive tangent here, but another experience I had a couple of weeks ago, actually, I was walking home on a rainy night. I had a big black coat on and my hood up, and a woman approached me saying, do you mind if I walk with you? There's just a big group of men behind me, just up to the like busy street ahead. And I was like, yeah, that's fine. Like walked up and I chatted to her and then made sure she got to the bus stop. But as I was walking home, I did think, what a horrible predicament she's in, because she doesn't know who I am. I'm just a man with my hood up. So I could have been anyone. I could have there. So she almost had to choose. Do I like risk it and walk home myself with this big group of men behind me, or do I approach this man by himself with his hood up?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is something that women face on a daily basis, and sometimes we don't even realize we're doing that. And again, I think the Me Too movement has, I think, sparked this discussion. And, you know, a lot of female friends will say, I do that, I do it all the time, and I didn't really think about why I do it, and it's only now. And it's almost just like I say, that it's unconscious almost. We are conditioned from a very, very young age to be wary of men and certain situations. And, you know, there are very good reasons for that, unfortunately. And yes, not all men are like that, obviously, thankfully, but we don't know which ones are and which ones aren't. So in some ways, the safest way you can kind of conduct your life is to assume that they all potentially are. And it's only until, you know, you get to know somebody and, you know, you can let your guard down to some extent. And it's a terrible way of being. And I'm sure, like I say, that men, decent men, don't want women to live like that either. And it would be much better if we didn't. But this is why, you know, I do think it's so important that women are permitted to have single sex spaces, etc., so that, you know, they have that place where they know they're not going to be exposed to male-bodied people that make them feel uncomfortable and potentially pose a risk to them. Like I say, we don't know which ones are and which ones aren't. So, you know, the only way is to almost assume that everybody poses a risk. But this is just something that, as a woman, you have to learn to deal with, and you're exposed to it from a very, very young age.
I think that's maybe why you're seeing a lot of, I think you see a lot of women going to gay bars, and you also see some men going to gay bars. I know Daniel Craig was in the news fairly recently saying that he goes to gay bars a lot because there's no chance of him getting into any sort of violence there. I want to talk about the media and how that plays a part. I think an interesting cliche I saw for films is that it's okay for men to not take no for an answer. That's romantic in films. But women do that. They're the crazy one for doing that.
Yeah.
They're the weird one. So I think that's one thing that we see a lot in the media. And another thing is, I think pornography has a massive impact on this. I think young boys are being exposed to pornography from an extremely young age without any restrictions, and they're not getting the sexual education that they should get. And I think 90% of pornography is from a male gaze, male dominated, and a lot of it is abuse. And I think males will grow up to expect that from women, and when they don't get that, that's maybe when they'll get aggressive and violent. A great idea I saw for sex education, I think a school in the US was doing it, is they were showing young boys pornography and then pointing out where the problems were with it and what they shouldn't be expecting, because people will say we should shield young boys from pornography, but that's not going to stop them from watching pornography.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that, really. I think, again, when we go back to, you know, why do we live in a society where domestic abuse is so prevalent? Things like the media, films, even music, I think all of those things have an impact on women and on men in different ways. And I think we still romanticize abuse of women, you know, not just within pornography, but that's obviously, you know, a big theme within pornography. But, you know, in the films, like you say, that it's seen as romantic for a man to relentlessly pursue a woman and don't take no for an answer, and you keep fighting for her, when actually what we're seeing there is stalking. You know, it's unwanted attention. You know, and a man forces himself on a woman in a film, and then eventually the woman relents and they fall in love and all of that nonsense. You know, none of that helps men or women. But I think, again, it's only fairly recently that we've started to perhaps see that for what it is, but we still see it too regularly. And once your eyes open to these kind of things, you can't unsee it. So you see it in films, you switch on the radio and you start listening to the lyrics of you know, some of the music, and you just think this is so derogatory, it's so stereotyped, this is really unhelpful. Yeah, you know, I think it's very, very difficult for young people growing up now with the pressures that they have on them from social media, etc., and, you know, the availability of pornography. You know, it's very difficult to avoid it. And what we are seeing, I think, is often quite abusive. As you say, it's unrealistic, isn't it? That's not how, you know, most people have sex, but that's how they think that sexual relations, you know, should be. So, you know, we're setting them up to fail from day one, and so much pornography is actually, you know, quite, well, a lot of it is very violent towards women. And again, I think it's very difficult for boys growing up to realise that, you know, that isn't a healthy relationship. That's not how women want to be treated, when everything they see online says different. So I agree that you can't stop children seeing this. It's all around them. So, you know, they do need to be educated about healthy relationships in every aspect of it. You know, there is, again, it's always women that end up on these courses of healthy relationships. There's something called the Freedom Programme, which lots of women who have been through abusive relationships are expected to attend if they've got social services involved, etc., if they've got children. And they're expected to go on these courses to learn about not just what an unhealthy relationship is, because that's what they've been living in, but actually comparing that to what a healthy relationship looks like, because sometimes they've never seen that. They might have grown up in a house where their parents were in a very abusive relationship as well. So they're not actually aware of what a respectful relationship looks like. And I think the same is probably true in terms of sex and pornography, that you know, we need to have these conversations with young people and not be embarrassed about it. And I think that we get embarrassed about it as much as they do, and that's why we don't want to have the conversation with them. But until we do, then, you know, we're setting both sexes up to fail massively.
I think some conversations I've seen, men have been saying that women want men to take control and women want men to be dominant. And of course, it's not true, but I think my response to that is usually that women want competence in a partner, and they don't want dominance. And if a woman wants to dominate a man, or if a man wants to dominate a woman, then there's maybe some underlying issues there, and that's not healthy for either party. I think there should be equal levels of respect, and men and women should want competence in a partner, and that's not anything to do with gender. That's just what a healthy relationship is. Yeah,
absolutely. You know, I totally agree with that. You know, and strength doesn't mean aggression either, does it? In a partner,
aggression means weakness.
Absolutely, really. Yeah, I totally agree. But again, I think there's an element of women. You know, some women think that this is how they should behave. That they should behave in a subordinate manner because that's what men want. So maybe we're all going around thinking, well, they want this and this is how I'm supposed to act. And the other party is also thinking similar, and neither are getting what they need from a relationship on occasion because of that. So I think, you know, it's about, you know, being healthy and having these conversations about what relationships are like, and having respect for the other person is the key to it, isn't it?
I think we could see that in the whole Will Smith thing in the media now, where people were saying like Will Smith was like strong for getting up there and standing up for women. But in my mind, I was like, Chris Rock was a strong one there. I mean, he was the one who stood there, he took it, he did not revert, he didn't go down to his level. Will Smith showed massive weakness there, and he's paying for it.
Yeah, I mean, it was very ugly, wasn't it? And it did make me think, well, you know, if somebody is prepared to act like that in front of all of those people, you know, then what's happening behind the scenes or in other circumstances when, you know, the whole world isn't watching. So, you know, aggression, there's never any justification for it. and and I think most people hopefully would agree that was unacceptable when they think about it.
I think it sparked a conversation between me and my partner, where my partner said, if you ever did anything like that, I would be utterly embarrassed and I would walk out the room. And what I said is that there's not much of a reason for me to stand up for you, because you're capable of standing up for yourself. I think this whole idea that men need to stand up for their women is implying that women can't stand up for themselves.
Yeah. And I think, what it's actually about is that he felt disrespected by it. It wasn't really about her at all. And I think often in those situations, perhaps men will blame it on, well, I was protecting the woman, I was being chivalrous or whatever, but actually it's about them feeling that their ego was being dented by another man, and therefore, he's going to react with aggression in relation to that. But I don't think it really had anything to do with her.
Do you think, is there any situation where it's acceptable for a man to hit a woman?
No.
Do you think it's ever acceptable for a woman to hit a man?
No, I don't think there's any, violence is unacceptable. The only situation where I think it's, again, not ideal, but you can understand it to some extent, is in situations where somebody has been victimised continually and they then end up snapping and retaliating. I think that can happen. And I'm quite sure that none of the people that have done that would say, I would want to do that again. If we look at the case of Sally Challen, who was convicted of murdering her husband, she had actually suffered years and years and years of humiliation and coercive control. And in the end, she snapped, but she would still say it was unacceptable what I did. At no stage has she tried to say, he got what was coming to him, he deserved it. She was always maintained that what she did was wrong. But it's about, I suppose, understanding how somebody is pushed into that situation where, that they're unable almost to control their actions because of the abuse of somebody else. But it's never the right thing to do.
I think it was her son that was in the Positive News article as well, because he'd campaigned for a few years. Well, I think it was about 10 years actually to have her released, and he still campaigns now because so many women out.
Yeah, he's done such fantastic work, and he's such a great male role model. He really is. And again, he's very honest. He was on Twitter recently talking about, how all of that has impacted on him and his mental health. Because, he's had to, I suppose, again, feel as though he has to be the strong one for his mum. And he's led that campaign for so long. But he is a fantastic role model for other men and, young people generally.
One thing I wanted to get your opinion of, just because of your profession, someone I had on 2 episodes ago was a philosopher called Greg Caruso. I share his view. He believes that there's no such thing as free will, that we shouldn't be blaming anyone for anything and we shouldn't be praising anyone for anything. Basically, we have no control over our actions because we have no control over so many different things prior to us carrying out action. And so his idea for reforming the penal system is that's what he calls the quarantine model, where he attributes that to if we went to a different country and contracted Ebola, the government would quarantine you away for the safety of everyone else in society. And he believes that's what we should do with anyone that commits a dangerous offence. We should be quarantining them away from society, but not actually punishing them. What's your thoughts on that?
That's quite a big area, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the no free will argument, really. I do think we all make choices on a daily basis. I think some choices are harder for some people to make because of their upbringing, etc., and what they've been exposed to. You know, a bit like we talked about Sally Challen. You know, I'm sure she didn't want to choose to do that, but the circumstances of her life had led her to that place. But I think, you know, generally speaking, we can choose to walk away or not. But I do think it's much more difficult for some people to exercise that free will. So I've forgotten the last part of the. You were talking about quarantining, weren't you? Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's helpful to punish and make prison into some kind of really unpleasant experience for the prisoner, because I think that potentially leads to a more dangerous person being released into society. So yeah, I don't think we should be, you know, torturing people in prison, for sure. I think the quarantine, I would call it protection rather than quarantine, that they are removed from society, I suppose, to mean that they can't continue to repeat those criminal acts. But it almost leads to the point where you could say that if you're saying there's no free will, actually you could take these people out before they do anything. You know, and you don't need to wait until they've actually committed this act that you say they were, you know, that they were always going to commit because of their life. That why don't you take them out before the act? You know, you could go that far with it, can't you? But obviously that's not how our system works. But I do think that we can often see some of these patterns emerging, and you can see sometimes a perpetrator, you know, committing acts that are only going one way in terms of seriousness. And sometimes we don't deal with those smaller acts quickly enough. I mean, look at, you know, Wayne Couzens, the police officer that murdered Sarah Everard. You know, he didn't suddenly just have this issue and, you know, go out and rape and murder Sarah Everard. There were loads of red flags about his behaviour beforehand, some of which were also criminal. You know, they're exposing himself and all of that. And again, I think these type of things are not taken very seriously. And it's almost, well, you know, he did that, he was just having a joke, it's what blokes do, and all of that kind of thing. You know, he was referred to at work as the rapist, and that, you know, all of those things that were really leading to the situation that he ended up in. Nobody should have been surprised, really. So, you know, should we be waiting for that to happen, or should we be trying to intervene earlier down the road? And I think we do need to intervene earlier. You know, I'm not suggesting that people should be arrested for, you know, their thoughts, but I think that once it starts to spill out into the way they act, then I think we just need to take those small incidents much more seriously, because they can be indicators of much more serious behaviour further down. It's a little bit like stalking. You know, on average, a woman will have experienced over 100 incidents of stalking before she ever picks the phone up to the police. So, you know, the police need to take that really seriously at day one. And when we look at most domestic homicides, we'll have had in the run-up to that an element of stalking before the murder happens. So, you know, if we're serious about tackling, you know, murder, rape, we need to deal with the less serious incidents much more seriously, in my view. And I think things like stalking, which obviously involves obsession and fixation, things like, you know, those lower grade sexual offences like exposing yourself, well, we need to take that much more seriously, I think, because what kind of person does that, and what potentially will that lead to?
I think like what you're saying about like intervening, I think there's ways to intervene in those sorts of cases, and there's also preventative measures more broadly that can be taken, like what's happening in these schools I was speaking about, bringing up boys because with surrounding that free will conversation, to me, these men that lead up to carrying out these horrible atrocities, they're generally, I would say, in their past, there is indicators that they will be the type of man that would carry that out. And it could even be abuse from onto them as children. It could be the way their parents were. It could be the way their friends were. It could be any number of things. And that's why I think there is preventative measures we can take broadly as a society. It's just that these are big changes, and these big changes don't tend to be taken seriously.
Yeah. And I think that the small things where, you could intervene on, they are not taken seriously at all. And I think in years to come, we will look at misogyny very, very differently, and treat it in the serious way that it should be treated. If you look at things like terrorism, there's been articles written recently discussing how when you look at the people that have been convicted of terrorist acts, the vast majority of them have got a history of domestic abuse. So there are real links between these kind of hateful behaviours, effectively, that somebody like that will express hate, often in a misogynistic way as well. And again, we need to take these smaller acts much, much more seriously, because they can lead to, very, very serious incidents later down the line, whether that be rape, murder, terrorism, whatever it is. We've got to deal with the red flags and not just ignore them or laugh them off and say, well, boys will be boys, what do you expect? All of that kind of thing, which allows that behaviour to just snowball, and, they don't come from nowhere.
Do you think, do any of the cases that you take on, does religion ever play a part? I think one thing I noticed, it was a couple of years ago, a lot of the conversations that were happening in liberal, no, I wouldn't say liberal, I would say kind of far left conversations were saying that any criticism of a religion is xenophobic. But I would say that can be anti-liberal. I think some religions treat women as second-class citizens, and it's okay to abuse women in the name of religion, or it's okay to abuse members of LGBTQ plus communities. And I think that's where reform needs to happen in religions like this. There needs to be, it's not just, you can't just say we can't criticize religion. We must, if it's affecting human rights, we must criticize religion.
Yeah, and I think, I also deal with quite a lot of honour-based violence cases as well. And I think sometimes there is a fear of asking too many questions, for fear of being seen as racist or whatever. But I think more than it being a religious issue, to me, religion is used as a means of controlling the victim, the woman, whatever situation that is. And it's not actually, when you look at what the religion says, that's not certainly how it should be interpreted. And I think, not all members of that religion will act in that way. So I think that it's more of a cultural thing than a religious problem. But perpetrators will use the religion to justify their behaviour, particularly if they're in a situation where perhaps the woman isn't as well educated in relation to the religion as they are. They will tell them all sorts of things that their religion apparently says, and why it's okay for them to do that and act in that way. But I think it's used as a tool of oppression more than anything.
So I'd like to end maybe on some solution-focused questions. So I suppose, what can men do you think? Should men be part of the conversation? Should men just purely be listening? What do you think?
I think that men should be feminist allies, and that they have a huge part to play in terms of this conversation and changing their behaviour. At the end of the day, if we're talking about the abuse of women by men, then only men can change that. So absolutely, they need to take this seriously on behalf of, you know, the whole of their sex, and to do much more in terms of the smaller things, challenging sexist behaviour when they see it. You know, I'm quite sure every man on earth has heard, you know, some pretty horrendous misogynistic jokes and comments made by their friends. And I'm quite sure in the majority of cases, they haven't challenged their friends over it. They might have thought he's an idiot, but they probably haven't said anything. So that guy then thinks that, oh yeah, everyone laughed at that joke, it's okay, it's fine. And somebody else, maybe a bit younger, thinks, oh, that's, you know, that everyone thinks this is funny, this is how I need to act. So I think there are lots and lots of small things that men can do to change the bigger picture, and just to, I suppose, think about their own behaviour. Sometimes it may be that they're not even realising that some of the things they do are intimidating women, etc. You know, we all need to think about what we can do to change things for the better. But I do think speaking out, and not just looking at yourself, but also being prepared to stand up and challenge. And it's quite a difficult thing to do. It's easy for me to say that. And I accept that some people will find it more difficult than others. But I think if more men did that, the change would happen much, much faster.
Do you have any optimism in this area? I think for me, my optimism comes from, with a lot of these, like with sexism and racism, is that I'd like to hope that it's generational. I'd like to hope that as more generations have these conversations, that this sort of behaviour dies with certain generations. And that's not me generalising and saying that every generation is racist, and that older generations are racist or sexist. But I do believe that with the conversations young people are having now, I'd like to think that these conversations will carry on as young people get older, and that this sort of behaviour will eventually, I don't think it'll ever die out, but I'd like to think it becomes a lot less of a problem.
I would hope that it will, but I feel that things are as bad now as they've ever been. And you know, there's not been any reduction in the amount of women that are being killed by their male partners, even though there is more money going into domestic abuse services, etc. Even though we've got, you know, all of these extra laws and powers from the police, you know, it's not reducing. So male behaviour isn't changing. And actually, you know, in some ways, I think women's positions are under attack more than they ever have been. So, you know, I am an optimist, and I think I would like to think that in a few generations things will be better. But I just think at the moment things are as bad as ever.
So if a woman is listening to this and thinks that they might be experiencing domestic violence, domestic abuse, where would you advise them to go?
So I would always advise them to report it to the police, and also, and I think this is equally important, to also speak to a local domestic abuse charity in your area who can offer you some practical advice, and also assist you sometimes in reporting it to the police, or assist you in circumstances where you feel the police haven't maybe taken it as seriously as you would want to. You know, they offer that service for free and can really make a difference in terms of helping you practically, and also in terms of, you know, all the legalities and dealing with the police.
Mm-hmm. If anyone listening or watching, I will link any local charities that they can do in the show notes. But Rachel, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. I think with these sorts of conversations, when I told people this was what I was going to be doing for the next 2 episodes, this was the conversations I was going to have, a lot of the response was very cheery subjects, but like in my head, it's majority of the subjects that aren't cheery are actually the most important subject. And I think this is at least a stepping stone, is having these sorts of open, non-judgmental conversations between men and women to come to some sort of solution. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for covering it. It's really important, and you know, it's good to hear your views about it as a man. And like I say, I don't think we're you know, very different really in respect of our views for it. So I suppose that's the positive, and that's the optimism that I'll take from it.
Well, that's good then. So let's wrap this up. So yeah, thank you very much for your time, and I'll let you get back to it. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks a lot. Thank you.